Sometimes the biggest mistake a man with a badge can make is assuming the man in front of him is nobody. The morning air in Liberty Park carried the soft scent of damp grass and fresh bread, the kind of quiet Saturday morning where the city seemed to breathe a little slower than usual. The sun hung low above the tree line, painting the walking paths in warm gold as joggers passed by in steady rhythm and parents pushed strollers along the gravel trails. Near the edge of a small pond, where the water reflected the sky like a sheet of glass, an older man sat calmly on a wooden bench. His name was Samuel Carter. At 67 years old, Samuel had the posture of someone who had lived a long life standing tall. His gray jacket rested neatly over a pressed button-down shirt, and beside him on the bench was a simple brown paper bag. Every few seconds he reached into that bag, broke off a small piece of bread, and scattered it gently across the grass in front of him. A small flock of pigeons fluttered down eagerly, their wings whispering against the cool air as they gathered around his feet. Samuel watched them with a quiet smile. It had become a routine over the past few years. Every Saturday morning, just after sunrise, he came to this exact bench with a loaf of bread and spent an hour feeding the birds. Most people walking through the park never thought much about it. To them, he was simply an older man enjoying retirement. What they didn't know was that Samuel Carter had once carried one of the most powerful titles in the entire city. But that morning, Samuel wasn't thinking about titles or careers or the decades he had spent wearing a uniform. His thoughts were somewhere softer, somewhere quieter. The bench beside the pond had been his wife Eleanor's favorite spot before she passed away 3 years earlier. She used to laugh every time the pigeons crowded around their feet, saying the birds trusted Samuel because he looked like the kind of man who never raised his voice. In many ways, she had been right. Samuel believed that calm carried more authority than shouting ever could. He tossed another piece of bread toward the grass and watched the birds hop closer. For a moment, the world felt perfectly still. Then the silence broke. The distant hum of an engine rolled across the park path, louder than the quiet morning deserved. A black and white patrol SUV pulled up near the walking trail and stopped abruptly beside the curb. The driver's door opened. Officer Derek Coleman stepped out. Derek was in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the restless energy of someone who believed authority should always be seen and heard. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished bright enough to catch the morning sun. He had been on the force for just under 2 years, and if you asked him, he would tell you he knew exactly how the streets worked. Derek's eyes scanned the park with quick suspicion, the way some officers were trained to do. Joggers passed without notice. Dog walkers moved along the path. But then his gaze stopped. There, by the pond, he saw Samuel sitting on the bench surrounded by birds and scattered crumbs of bread across the grass. Derek frowned immediately. To him it didn't look peaceful. It looked suspicious. He started walking across the grass, boots pressing firmly into the damp ground as the pigeons shifted nervously around Samuel's feet. Samuel heard the footsteps approaching long before the officer spoke. But he didn't turn right away. He simply tossed one last piece of bread onto the grass and brushed the crumbs from his hands. The birds fluttered again. The officer's shadow stretched across the ground beside the bench. And then came the voice, sharp and impatient in the quiet morning air. "Hey, you can't be doing that here." Samuel slowly lifted his eyes toward the young officer standing in front of him. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The pigeons fluttered again, lifting into the air as if sensing the tension that had just entered the park. Samuel studied the officer calmly. Derek Coleman looked back at him with the firm confidence of someone who believed he was already in control of the situation. What Derek didn't realize, not yet, was that the quiet man sitting on that park bench had once been the one person every officer in this city answered to. Officer Derek Coleman rested one hand on his duty belt as he looked down at the scattered breadcrumbs on the grass, his expression tightening as if the quiet scene in front of him had personally offended him. The pigeons circled once overhead before settling again several feet away, cautious now, their small heads tilting as they watched the two men. Samuel Carter remained seated on the bench, his hands folded calmly over the empty paper bag, his posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place under the weight of the officer's attention. Derek cleared his throat and spoke again, louder this time, as if volume alone could establish control. "I said you cannot feed the birds here." It is against park regulations. Samuel lifted his eyes slowly toward the officer. His expression was not defensive, not irritated, simply attentive. "Good morning, officer," he said in a steady voice. "I did not realize that was a problem." Derek gestured sharply toward the ground where the crumbs had scattered across the grass. "It is a problem because it attracts animals, makes a mess, and creates complaints. There are signs posted all over the park." Samuel glanced briefly toward the walking path where a small wooden sign stood several yards away, half hidden behind a row of shrubs. He had passed that sign countless times over the years. It mentioned littering and keeping the park clean. It said nothing about birds. But Samuel did not argue. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind that suggested patience rather than surrender. "If it causes trouble, I can stop," he said calmly. For a moment, Derek seemed almost surprised by the lack of resistance. He had approached expecting excuses, arguments, or the defensive tone he believed he often encountered during stops like this. Instead, he found a quiet older man who spoke with careful respect. The calm response did not relax him. If anything, it made him more suspicious. Derek took another step closer to the bench. "You got identification on you?" he asked. Samuel tilted his head slightly. "Is that necessary?" Derek crossed his arms. "When someone breaks a park rule, yes, it can be necessary." A couple walking their golden retriever slowed down along the path nearby, their conversation fading as curiosity drew their attention toward the exchange. The dog sat quietly beside them, tail swishing against the gravel while they watched. Samuel noticed them, but kept his focus on the officer standing in front of him. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his gray jacket, pulling out a slim leather wallet. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, the kind of careful movement that came from decades of understanding how tension could grow from small misunderstandings. Derek watched the movement closely. Samuel opened the wallet and glanced at the contents for a moment before pausing. Instead of immediately handing over the identification, he looked back up at the officer. "Officer," he said gently, "how long have you been working this district?" Derek frowned slightly at the unexpected question. "Why does that matter?" Samuel offered a faint smile, one that carried the quiet patience of someone who had asked questions like this many times before. "Just curious," he said. "Parks like this tend to have their own rhythm. Takes a little time to understand it." Derek shifted his stance, clearly uninterested in conversation. "What matters is the rules," he replied firmly. "And right now you are not following them." Samuel studied him for a moment, his eyes calm, thoughtful. There was no anger there, no challenge, only observation. The pigeons fluttered again near the edge of the pond, their wings briefly catching the sunlight. A light breeze moved across the water, sending gentle ripples toward the shore. For a moment, Samuel seemed more focused on the quiet motion of the lake than the officer standing in front of him. Then he closed the wallet and held it loosely in one hand. "You know," he said slowly, "sometimes the way we approach a situation matters just as much as the rule itself." Derek let out a short breath through his nose, clearly unimpressed. "Sir, I am not here for philosophy. I am here to do my job." Samuel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. "I understand that," he replied. "I spent many years around that same idea." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. "Around what idea?" Samuel's faint smile returned as he looked toward the flock of birds settling once again along the grass. "The idea of wearing a badge," he said quietly, "and learning what it really means." The officer studied him for a moment, uncertain whether the comment carried meaning or simply the ramblings of a retiree enjoying the park. Behind them, the quiet morning continued. Joggers passed. Leaves rustled along the path. And the city moved forward without noticing that a conversation on a quiet park bench was about to become far more important than Officer Derek Coleman could possibly imagine. Officer Derek Coleman stared at the older man for a moment, trying to decide whether the comment had been meant as a joke or a challenge. Samuel Carter's voice had been calm, almost reflective, but there was something in the way he said it that lingered in the air. Derek shifted his weight slightly, glancing again at the small paper bag resting beside Samuel on the bench. "Look," Derek said after a pause, his tone firm but slightly impatient. "This is simple. You cannot feed birds here, and I asked for identification. That is all I need from you." Samuel nodded slowly, as if considering the request rather than resisting it. Around them the park continued to wake up. A woman pushing a stroller walked along the paved path behind the pond, her young child pointing excitedly at the pigeons now gathered several yards away. The golden retriever from earlier had moved closer with its owners, sitting quietly while they watched the exchange with polite curiosity. Samuel noticed the small audience forming and gave a soft sigh that carried more patience than frustration. He had spent most of his life in situations where people watched how officers behaved. Moments like these were never just about rules. They were about judgment. He held the leather wallet loosely in his hand, but still did not hand it over. Instead, he spoke again in the same steady tone. "Officer Coleman, is it?" Derek blinked slightly. He had not introduced himself yet. His name tag rested clearly on the front of his uniform, but most people never bothered to read it during an encounter like this. "Yes," Derek replied cautiously. "And that means you should already know that when an officer asks for identification, you provide it." Samuel gave another small nod. "That is generally how those conversations go," he agreed. His eyes drifted briefly toward the pond where sunlight shimmered across the water in bright silver lines. For a few seconds he seemed lost in the quiet movement of the lake. Then he looked back toward Derek with a calm expression that never changed. "But sometimes," Samuel added gently, "the way a conversation begins can shape how it ends." Derek exhaled sharply, clearly growing tired of what he believed was unnecessary philosophy. "Sir, you are making this harder than it needs to be." Samuel's lips curved slightly into a faint smile. "That was never my intention." Derek crossed his arms, the leather of his duty belt creaking slightly as he shifted his stance. "Then help me understand something," he said. "You come out here early in the morning, feed birds even though the park rules say not to, and now you want to debate the meaning of conversations with a police officer." Samuel listened without interrupting. When Derek finished speaking, the older man simply rested his hands together again, the wallet still between his fingers. His voice remained even and thoughtful. "I come here every Saturday," he explained quietly, "just after sunrise. I sit on this bench, watch the water, and feed the birds. I have done it for 3 years now." Derek raised an eyebrow. "That does not make it allowed." "No," Samuel agreed. "But it does make it familiar." Derek frowned, unsure what the man meant. Samuel continued speaking slowly. His words measured the way someone speaks when they know patience often reveals more than confrontation. "You see, Officer Coleman, when you spend enough mornings in one place, you begin to notice things. The jogger who runs the same path every day at 6:30. The couple with the golden retriever who always stops near the pond. The park employee who checks the trash bins every Saturday at 7. Derek glanced briefly toward the path where the couple with the dog stood, then back at Samuel. "And?" he asked. Samuel gestured lightly toward the quiet park around them. "And you also notice when something new arrives." Derek's expression hardened slightly. "What is that supposed to mean?" Samuel met his gaze calmly. "It means you are new to this district." The words were not an accusation. They were simply a statement. Derek hesitated for a moment before answering. "I transferred here 2 weeks ago." Samuel nodded as if confirming a small detail he had already suspected. "That explains it," he said softly. Derek's patience finally began to thin. "Explains what exactly?" Samuel looked at him with the same steady calm that had not wavered since the officer arrived. "Why you see a man feeding birds," he replied gently, "instead of seeing the whole park." The pigeons fluttered again across the grass, their wings brushing the quiet air. The golden retriever barked once in curiosity before settling back beside its owners. For a brief moment, the entire park seemed to pause around the conversation unfolding on that wooden bench. Derek Coleman still believed he was dealing with a stubborn retiree who did not want to follow a simple rule. What he did not realize yet was that every calm word Samuel Carter spoke carried the quiet experience of someone who had once spent decades teaching officers exactly how these moments should be handled. Officer Derek Coleman looked at the older man with growing irritation, the calm tone of Samuel Carter's voice beginning to feel less like politeness and more like quiet resistance. Derek had dealt with people who argued loudly and people who refused to cooperate, but this was different. Samuel didn't either. He simply sat there, speaking slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. Derek let out a breath and gestured again toward the crumbs scattered across the grass. "Sir, this is still a violation of park policy," he said firmly. "Whether you come here every week or not does not change that." Samuel listened without reacting. The pigeons had drifted closer again, cautiously hopping across the grass as if the tension between the two men did not concern them at all. Samuel watched them for a moment before turning his attention back to the officer. "Policies matter," he said quietly. "But so does judgment." Derek shook his head slightly. "That sounds nice, but rules are rules." Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied, "they are." For a moment the conversation paused. The breeze moved gently through the trees lining the pond, rustling the leaves in soft waves. A jogger passed along the path, slowing briefly as she noticed the patrol vehicle parked near the curb before continuing on her way. The couple with the golden retriever remained nearby, pretending to watch the water while clearly listening to every word. Derek glanced at them briefly before turning his attention back to Samuel. "You still have not given me your identification," he said. Samuel looked down at the wallet in his hand, then back at the officer. "You are right," he said calmly. "I have not." Derek extended his hand expectantly. Samuel studied him for a moment longer. There was something thoughtful in his expression, as if he were measuring not just the request but the moment itself. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying the same steady calm it had held since the beginning. "Officer Coleman, do you know what the hardest part of wearing that badge is?" Derek frowned. "That is not relevant to this stop." Samuel tilted his head slightly. "It might be more relevant than you think." Derek crossed his arms again, clearly losing patience. "Sir, I did not come here for a lecture." Samuel smiled faintly. "Most people do not," he said. The pigeons fluttered suddenly as a small group of children ran past along the path, laughing as they chased each other across the grass. The sound carried across the pond and faded into the distance. Samuel watched them go for a moment, the quiet smile still resting on his face. Then he turned back toward Derek. "The hardest part of wearing that badge," he said gently, "is remembering that people see it before they see you." Derek stared at him, unsure whether to respond. Samuel continued speaking slowly, the rhythm of his words calm and deliberate. "When someone looks at a police officer, they are not just seeing one person. They are seeing the entire department, the entire system of authority behind that uniform. Every word you say represents more than yourself." Derek shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but unwilling to admit it. "Sir, I am aware of my responsibilities." Samuel nodded again. "I am sure you believe that." Derek's expression tightened. "Believe," he repeated. "I know it." Samuel's eyes remained steady. "Good," he said softly. "Because that belief shapes how people remember encounters like this." Derek gestured toward the bench impatiently. "What people will remember is that I asked someone to stop breaking a park rule." Samuel considered that for a moment before answering. "Perhaps," he said, "but they will also remember how you chose to speak to a stranger sitting on a quiet bench." The officer glanced briefly toward the couple with the dog again, noticing that they were still listening. A faint flush crept into his expression. Samuel noticed it, but did not comment. Instead, he slowly closed the leather wallet in his hand and placed it gently beside him on the bench. Derek noticed immediately. "Sir," he said firmly, "I asked for identification." Samuel looked at him calmly. "And you will have it," he replied. The breeze moved again across the pond, carrying the distant sound of city traffic somewhere beyond the trees. Samuel rested his hands loosely on his knees and met the officer's gaze once more. "But before I hand it over," he said quietly, "there is something you should probably understand about this bench, this park, and the man you decided to stop this morning." Derek Coleman stood there in the soft sunlight of Liberty Park, still convinced he was managing a simple situation involving a stubborn retiree and a minor rule violation. What he did not yet realize was that the quiet man sitting in front of him had spent an entire career teaching officers exactly how moments like this could define the meaning of a badge. Officer Derek Coleman stood silently for a moment after Samuel Carter finished speaking, the quiet confidence in the older man's voice hanging in the air like a question that had not yet been answered. Derek had approached the bench expecting a routine interaction that would last perhaps 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most. Instead, the conversation had stretched longer than he liked, and something about the calm way Samuel spoke made him feel as though the ground beneath the moment was shifting slightly, even if he could not yet explain why. Derek straightened his posture and spoke again with a firm tone, determined to bring the exchange back under control. "Sir, whatever explanation you think I need can wait. Right now I just need to see your identification." Samuel Carter looked up at him without any sign of frustration. His eyes were steady, thoughtful, the eyes of someone who had spent many years watching situations unfold before choosing the exact moment to respond. Around them, the park continued its slow Saturday rhythm. The golden retriever's owners were now pretending to examine the ducks along the pond while quietly listening. The stroller from earlier had returned along the path, the child inside pointing toward the birds with bright excitement. Life in the park carried on, unaware that something important was quietly building on a single wooden bench beside the water. Samuel lifted the leather wallet from the bench and held it in his hands for a moment. He turned it over once, as if considering the small weight it carried, then looked back toward Derek. "You are right about one thing," he said calmly. "Conversations like this usually move quickly." Derek nodded impatiently. "Exactly." Samuel gave a small thoughtful pause. "But sometimes they should not." Derek frowned. "Why not?" Samuel glanced across the pond, watching a line of sunlight stretch across the water as the morning climbed higher in the sky. "Because the way we handle small moments can tell us a lot about bigger ones," he said quietly. Derek exhaled again, clearly growing tired of what he believed was unnecessary reflection. "Sir, with respect, feeding birds in a park is not a big moment." Samuel looked back at him and smiled faintly. "No," he agreed. "It usually is not." The pigeons hopped closer again, their small claws tapping lightly against the gravel near Samuel's shoes. One bird tilted its head toward Derek before fluttering back toward the grass. The simple movement seemed to underline how peaceful the morning had been only minutes earlier. Samuel rested the wallet against his palm and spoke again, this time a little more directly. "Officer Coleman, when you first walked up to this bench, what did you see?" Derek answered immediately. "I saw someone breaking a park rule." Samuel nodded slowly. "And what else?" Derek hesitated slightly. "That was enough." Samuel tilted his head a little, as if that answer confirmed something he had already expected. "You saw crumbs on the grass," Samuel continued, "and a man sitting on a bench." Derek shrugged lightly. "Yes." Samuel's eyes moved across the park for a moment, taking in the path, the trees, the quiet pond, and the small groups of people enjoying the morning. Then he looked back at the officer. "You did not see the reason I come here every Saturday morning." Derek remained silent. Samuel's voice stayed calm and measured. "You did not see the bench my wife loved before she passed away." The words were not dramatic. They were simply spoken with quiet honesty. Derek shifted slightly, unsure how to respond. Samuel continued gently. "You did not see the habit that helped an old man adjust to a quieter life after 40 years of working long nights and longer weeks." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. 40 years doing what? Samuel studied him for a moment before answering. "Serving this city." The words were simple, but the way Samuel said them carried a quiet weight that made the surrounding air feel different for a moment. Derek noticed the shift, but did not fully understand it yet. "Lots of people serve the city," he replied cautiously. Samuel nodded. "That is true." The breeze moved across the pond again, rippling the reflection of the sky in long silver waves. Samuel held the wallet a moment longer, then slowly opened it. For the first time since the conversation began, he extended it toward the officer. "You asked for identification," he said calmly, "and you deserve to see it." Derek reached out and took the wallet, his eyes already scanning the card inside. At first he expected nothing unusual, just another driver's license belonging to a retired resident enjoying the park. But as his eyes focused on the name printed clearly across the card, the confident rhythm of his breathing slowed. Because the name in front of him was one he had heard many times during training at the department. A name that still appeared in old case studies and leadership seminars. Samuel Carter. Derek Coleman felt the air in his chest pause as his eyes settled on the name printed clearly across the identification card in his hand. For a brief second, he simply stared, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary if he looked long enough. But they did not change. Samuel Carter. The name sat there quietly, unmistakably familiar in a way Derek had not expected. He had seen that name before, not on a park bench and not on a driver's license, but in the training rooms of the police academy where instructors spoke about leadership, reforms, and the evolution of the department. Derek blinked once and looked again, as if confirmation might somehow erase the sudden weight pressing against his thoughts. The older man remained seated on the bench exactly as he had been before, calm and composed, watching the pond with the same steady patience. The pigeons had gathered again around the grass, pecking at the last scattered crumbs as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Derek slowly lifted his eyes from the card and looked back at Samuel Carter. The quiet confidence in the older man's posture suddenly made a different kind of sense. For the first time since arriving at the park, Derek felt the faintest shift in his certainty. "Samuel Carter," he said under his breath, almost as if repeating the name aloud might clarify the situation. Samuel looked at him with a gentle expression that carried neither pride nor challenge. "That is correct," he said simply. Derek's mind raced through fragments of memory. During academy lectures, instructors had occasionally referenced a former chief who had modernized community policing strategies nearly a decade earlier. His leadership seminars were still circulated inside the department. Some of the policies officers followed every day had originated under his administration. Derek had never expected to meet that man sitting quietly on a wooden bench beside a pond. For a moment the young officer felt the quiet park around him grow strangely still. The breeze that moved across the water seemed louder now, the distant sounds of footsteps along the path sharper in his ears. Behind him the couple with the golden retriever exchanged a brief glance, sensing the subtle shift in the conversation even if they did not fully understand it. Derek cleared his throat, trying to steady the professional tone he had used earlier. "You are, that Samuel Carter?" The question came out more uncertain than he intended. Samuel gave a small nod. "I was," he replied calmly. "These days I am mostly just a man who enjoys a quiet park." Derek glanced down at the identification again, then back toward the older man. The calm way Samuel spoke made the moment feel even heavier. Nothing about him suggested someone trying to prove a point. If anything, his voice carried the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning of the conversation. Derek returned the wallet slowly, his movements no longer as quick or certain as they had been earlier. Samuel accepted it with the same gentle ease he had shown when handing it over. For several seconds neither man spoke. The pigeons fluttered across the grass again, lifting briefly into the air before settling near the edge of the pond. Finally Derek broke the silence. "You never mentioned that earlier," he said carefully. Samuel folded the wallet and slipped it back inside his jacket pocket. "You did not ask," he replied softly. Derek hesitated. That answer landed with more weight than Samuel probably intended. It was not an accusation. It was simply a statement. Derek shifted his stance slightly, looking out across the park as if noticing the place properly for the first time since he arrived. Families walked along the path. A jogger passed in steady rhythm. The small, everyday life of the park had never stopped moving. Samuel watched the officer quietly, giving him space to process the moment. After another pause Derek spoke again, his voice calmer now. "Chief Carter," he said, the title slipping out naturally this time. Samuel raised a hand slightly. "Just Samuel is fine," he replied with a faint smile. Derek nodded slowly. "Samuel," he corrected. "I did not realize who you were." Samuel leaned back slightly on the bench, his gaze drifting toward the water again. "Most mornings that is exactly how I prefer it," he said. Derek considered those words for a moment. The tension that had filled the conversation earlier had faded into something quieter now, something more reflective. The young officer realized that the entire exchange had unfolded in front of several silent witnesses who had simply watched how he handled the situation. Samuel looked back at him gently and spoke again in the same calm tone that had never once risen or hardened. "Officer Coleman," he said softly, "the badge you wear carries a long history. Every officer adds to that history one conversation at a time." Derek stood there beside the bench, the morning sunlight reflecting off his badge as he listened. For the first time since arriving in Liberty Park, he began to understand that the quiet man feeding birds had been showing him something far more important than a park rule. Officer Derek Coleman stood quietly beside the bench, the weight of the moment settling into his posture as the early morning sunlight reflected softly across the surface of the pond. The conversation that had begun as a simple enforcement of a park rule now felt completely different. Samuel Carter remained seated, his calm presence unchanged, his attention drifting between the officer and the gentle movement of the birds gathering again along the grass. For a few seconds Derek did not speak. He simply looked out across the park as if seeing it properly for the first time since he arrived. The stroller from earlier rolled slowly past along the path. The child inside pointed toward the pigeons again, laughing as the birds fluttered into the air before settling back down. The couple with the golden retriever had stopped pretending to watch the water and now stood openly observing the quiet exchange unfolding beside the bench. Derek finally exhaled and shifted his weight slightly, his voice more measured than it had been earlier. "Samuel," he said carefully, still adjusting to the name without the title he had almost used again. "I did not mean any disrespect earlier." Samuel looked at him with the same calm expression that had never once changed during the entire encounter. "I know," he replied gently. Derek nodded once, though the motion carried a trace of uncertainty. "It is just part of the job to address situations like this," he continued. Samuel leaned back slightly on the bench, folding his hands loosely together. "It is," he agreed. The pigeons hopped closer again, pecking lightly at the last crumbs of bread scattered across the grass. One bird fluttered briefly onto the bench beside Samuel before hopping back down toward the ground. The simple movement seemed to soften the tension that had once filled the air. Derek watched the birds for a moment before speaking again. "You said earlier that the way a conversation begins can shape how it ends." Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes." Derek glanced toward the path where several people had paused their morning routines just long enough to see how the interaction unfolded. Then he looked back at Samuel. "I think I understand what you meant now." Samuel's faint smile returned, quiet and thoughtful. "Understanding usually arrives after the moment passes," he said softly. Derek let out a small breath, the seriousness in his posture easing slightly. "During training they talked about you," he admitted. "Your leadership programs, the reforms you introduced, the way you pushed officers to work closer with the community." Samuel tilted his head slightly, listening without interrupting. Derek continued slowly. "I never expected to run into you sitting on a park bench feeding birds." Samuel looked out across the pond again, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the water. "Life becomes simpler after retirement," he said calmly. Derek allowed himself a small smile at that. For the first time since arriving, the situation no longer felt like a confrontation. It felt like a lesson that had quietly unfolded without anger, without raised voices, and without any need for authority to be forced. Samuel glanced toward the small wooden sign partially hidden behind the shrubs near the walking path. "For the record," he added lightly, "that sign actually mentions littering, not birds." Derek turned to look at the sign for the first time. From the angle where he stood, the lettering was just visible enough to confirm what Samuel had said. Derek shook his head slightly and let out a quiet laugh at himself. "I should probably read those more." "Carefully," he admitted. Samuel's eyes reflected a trace of humor. "Careful observation is one of the most useful tools an officer can have." Derek nodded slowly, the words landing more clearly now than they might have earlier that morning. The breeze moved gently across the park again, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the city streets beyond the trees. Liberty Park had returned completely to its peaceful rhythm. The tension that once surrounded the bench had faded into a calm conversation between two men separated by decades of experience, but connected by the same uniform they had both worn. Derek straightened slightly and looked back towards Samuel with a respectful expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. Samuel raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. "For what?" Derek glanced briefly at the birds, then back at the older man sitting beside the pond. "For reminding me what the badge actually stands for." Samuel's faint smile returned once more as he watched the pigeons lift into the air again, their wings catching the morning light as they circled gently above the water before drifting back toward the grass. The quiet morning in Liberty Park continued to unfold with the same gentle rhythm it had carried since sunrise, but for Officer Derek Coleman, the park no longer felt quite the same. He stood beside the wooden bench looking out across the water where the pigeons circled once more before settling again on the grass. The moment that had started as a routine stop had turned into something else entirely, something quieter and far more reflective. Samuel Carter remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze following the birds as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The sunlight had climbed higher now, warming the gravel path and reflecting softly across the surface of the pond. A pair of ducks drifted lazily through the water while families continued their morning walks along the trail. Life in the park moved forward without interruption, Yet for Derek the world seemed slightly different than it had been 30 minutes earlier. He looked down briefly at the badge pinned to the front of his uniform. Only a short time ago he had approached this bench believing he was simply enforcing a rule. Now that same badge felt heavier, not because of authority, but because of the responsibility Samuel had quietly reminded him about. Derek cleared his throat gently and turned back toward the older man. "Samuel," he said, his tone calm and respectful. "May I ask you something?" Samuel shifted slightly on the bench and nodded. "Of course." Derek glanced across the pond before continuing. "After everything you accomplished in the department, all those years leading the city, why do you still come here every week to feed birds?" Samuel looked out at the grass where the pigeons hopped calmly through the remaining crumbs of bread. A small breeze lifted the edge of his jacket as he considered the question. "Because it reminds me of something important," he said quietly. Derek waited. Samuel continued in the same thoughtful tone. "When you spend decades working inside a department, you can start to see the city only through calls, reports, and problems that need solving. Every shift becomes about responding to something wrong." Derek nodded slowly, understanding that rhythm well even in his short career. Samuel gestured gently toward the park around them. "Places like this remind you that most people are simply living their lives, walking their dogs, pushing strollers, watching birds. The job exists to protect that normal life, not to control it." Derek looked around again, seeing the park through that lens. The couple with the golden retriever had resumed their walk. The stroller had disappeared around the curve of the path. The jogger returned along the trail with steady determination. For the first time since arriving, Derek noticed how peaceful the place actually was. Samuel's voice remained calm. "When officers forget that, they start to see every situation as a problem waiting to happen instead of a moment that deserves patience." Derek thought about his own approach earlier that morning. The quick judgment, the sharp tone, the assumption that the rule was the only thing that mattered. Samuel was not criticizing him. Yet the lesson was unmistakable. Samuel reached down beside the bench and lifted the empty paper bag that once held the bread. He folded it neatly and placed it back beside him. "The badge," he continued gently, "does not give someone power over people. It gives them responsibility toward people." Derek listened carefully. The words were simple, but they carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived by them for many years. The pigeons fluttered again across the grass, their wings catching the bright morning light as they lifted briefly into the air before settling once more near the water's edge. Derek watched them with a thoughtful expression. After a moment he spoke again. "I think I will remember this morning for a long time." Samuel smiled faintly. "That is the hope." Derek let out a quiet breath and adjusted his stance slightly, the tension from earlier completely gone now. The interaction that had begun with suspicion had ended with something much more valuable. Samuel leaned back on the bench, his eyes following the birds once again as they hopped through the grass. The park returned fully to its peaceful rhythm, and the quiet lesson of the morning settled gently into the mind of a young officer who had just learned that sometimes the most important moments of authority happen not during emergencies or dramatic calls, but during simple conversations on a quiet bench beside a pond. Officer Derek Coleman remained standing beside the bench for a moment longer after Samuel Carter finished speaking, the quiet weight of the conversation settling gently into his thoughts. The morning in Liberty Park had fully awakened now. Sunlight stretched across the gravel paths, warming the air as more people arrived to enjoy the peaceful space. A group of teenagers walked past laughing softly, and somewhere farther along the trail a cyclist's bell rang briefly before fading into the distance. Yet beside the pond, the calm atmosphere remained unchanged, as if the small wooden bench had quietly become a place where something important had been passed from one generation to another. Derek looked out across the water once more. The surface of the pond shimmered under the rising sun, reflecting the pale blue sky above. The pigeons that had gathered earlier now fluttered calmly across the grass, their wings brushing the air in soft bursts of movement before settling again near Samuel's feet. The young officer slowly placed his hands behind his back in a relaxed stance, no longer standing in the rigid posture he had carried when he first approached. "Samuel," he said thoughtfully, "when you led the department, did you ever imagine moments like this happening?" Samuel looked up from the birds with a gentle expression. "Moments like what?" Derek gestured lightly toward the bench, the pond, the quiet park around them. A conversation like this. A young officer stopping a retired chief without realizing who he was. Samuel chuckled softly, the sound warm and calm. Moments like that happen more often than you might think, he said. Derek raised an eyebrow with curiosity. Samuel leaned back slightly and rested his hands comfortably on the bench. Every officer eventually encounters a situation that teaches them something they were not expecting to learn, he continued. Sometimes it happens during a major investigation. Sometimes during a difficult call. And sometimes, he added with a faint smile, it happens while feeding birds in a park. Derek could not help but smile at that. The earlier tension felt almost distant now, replaced by a quiet respect that had grown naturally through the conversation. Samuel looked toward the pond again and watched the gentle movement of the water for a moment before speaking once more. The truth is, he said softly, the badge is never really about the person wearing it. Derek listened carefully. Samuel continued. It is about the trust people place in the uniform. That trust is built slowly, one conversation at a time. The pigeons fluttered again as a small breeze moved across the grass, lifting a few remaining crumbs into the air. Samuel brushed his hands together lightly and stood up from the bench for the first time since Derek had arrived. The movement was slow but steady, the posture of someone who had carried responsibility for many years and still moved with quiet confidence. Derek stepped slightly to the side, giving him room. Samuel looked around the park one more time, taking in the peaceful scene before him. Families walking together, dogs trotting along the path, children pointing toward the water with bright curiosity. The simple life of the city unfolding in a place that felt safe and calm. Samuel turned back toward Derek with the same gentle expression he had carried all morning. Take care of that trust, he said quietly. Derek nodded, the meaning of the words settling deeply in his mind. I will, he replied sincerely. Samuel picked up the folded paper bag from the bench and placed it neatly into a nearby trash bin. Then he began walking slowly along the path beside the pond, his hands resting comfortably in his jacket pockets as the pigeons scattered lightly across the grass behind him. Derek watched him go for a moment, standing quietly beneath the warm morning sunlight. The lesson of the morning had not come through discipline or authority, but through patience, dignity, and a conversation that had unfolded exactly when it needed to. As Samuel Carter disappeared farther down the path, the park returned completely to its peaceful rhythm. Officer Derek Coleman looked once more at the badge on his chest, then out at the people enjoying their morning around the pond. And in that quiet moment, he understood something that every good officer eventually learns. The badge may represent authority, but the way it is used will always define what it truly means.